The photograph measures 4 inches by 6. Its edges have yellowed with the patience of time, and its surface carries the faint scratches of 100 careless hands. It was discovered in 2019, tucked inside a family Bible that had not been opened in decades, in an estate sale in Ridgewood, New Jersey. The buyer paid $11 for the Bible and found, between the pages of Ecclesiastes, a window into 1877. At first glance, the image appears unremarkable. A family of 5 sits on a blanket in what seems to be a meadow. The father wears a dark suit, his beard trimmed with the precision of a man who believes appearance is moral discipline. Beside him, the mother holds an infant wrapped in white cloth. 2 older children, a boy of perhaps 8 and a girl no older than 6, sit cross-legged at the edge of the frame, their faces caught in that strange stillness that long exposure times demanded. Behind them, a single oak tree spreads its branches like a canopy of protection. The sky is pale, washed out by the limitations of wet plate collodion. And beneath them, the ground. It was the ground that made this photograph famous. In 2021, a digital restoration specialist named Arthur Brennan was hired by a private collector to enhance a series of Victorian-era images. The picnic photograph was among them. Brennan had restored thousands of old photographs in his career, faded portraits, damaged tintypes, images eaten by mold and time. He approached this one with the same clinical detachment he brought to all his work. But when he adjusted the contrast and sharpened the shadows beneath the family's blanket, his hand stopped on the mouse. The ground beneath them was not grass. It was mounds, small, deliberate mounds arranged in rows, partially visible at the edges of the blanket, extending into the background where the meadow dissolved into blur. The shapes were unmistakable to anyone who had ever visited a cemetery. They were graves, dozens of them, perhaps more. The family in the photograph had chosen to picnic on a burial ground. Brennan shared his discovery with a colleague, who shared it with a historian, who shared it with a journalist. Within weeks, the image had circulated through academic forums and social media platforms, accompanied by a single question that no one could answer. Who were these people, and why were they eating above the dead? The photograph bore no inscription, no date written on its reverse, no studio mark to identify its origin. The Bible in which it had been found offered no genealogical clues. Its family registry pages had been torn out long before the estate sale. The only evidence was the image itself, and the silent testimony of those uneven mounds beneath the smiling family. Historians who examined the photograph noted several details that placed it firmly in the mid to late 1870s. The mother's dress, with its fitted bodice and modest bustle, reflected the fashion of that precise era. The father's collar style, the children's clothing, even the weave of the picnic blanket, all pointed to a narrow window of time. The oak tree, too, offered clues. Its species, its approximate age based on trunk diameter, and the angle of its shadow suggested a location somewhere in the northeastern United States, likely in late spring or early summer. But it was the graves that demanded explanation. In the years following the Civil War, America was a nation still learning how to bury its dead. The conflict had claimed over 600,000 lives, and the infrastructure of death, the cemeteries, the undertakers, the rituals of mourning, had been overwhelmed. Mass graves had been dug on battlefields, bodies had been lost, misidentified, or never recovered at all. Families who could afford it paid to have their sons and husbands exhumed and transported home. Those who could not learn to grieve without a grave to visit. By 1877, the formal cemetery movement had transformed how Americans thought about death. Rural cemeteries like Mount Auburn in Massachusetts and Greenwood in Brooklyn had popularized the idea of burial grounds as landscaped parks, places of beauty and contemplation where the living could walk among the dead without fear. Picnicking in cemeteries was not merely accepted, it was encouraged. Families spread blankets on the grass, shared meals beside headstones, and treated the dead as silent companions in the rituals of the living. But the graves in this photograph were not the manicured plots of a rural cemetery. They were unmarked, uneven, crowded together with the haste of necessity rather than the care of ceremony. They looked less like a place of rest and more like a place of concealment. The question was not whether this family had chosen to picnic among graves. The question was whose graves they were. In the months that followed the photograph's discovery, several theories emerged. Some suggested the image depicted a family cemetery on private land, a common practice in rural America, where generations of the same bloodline were buried on the property they had farmed. Others proposed that the site was a forgotten pauper's field, where the indigent and unclaimed were interred without marker or memorial. A few darker interpretations suggested something more deliberate, that the photograph was a kind of trophy, a record of proximity to something the family had caused or condoned. None of these theories could be confirmed. The photograph remained an artifact without context, a question without answer, until someone found the letters. In 2023, a graduate student at Columbia University named Elena Vasquez was researching the history of unmarked burial sites in the northeastern United States. Her dissertation focused on the forgotten dead, the enslaved, the institutionalized, the executed, and the abandoned whose bodies had been buried without record or recognition. In the course of her research, she encountered a reference to a collection of letters held by a small historical society in rural Pennsylvania. The letters had been written between 1875 and 1879 by a woman named Harriet Summerfield to her sister in Philadelphia. They described in meticulous detail the daily life of a family that had recently purchased a farm in what was then called Willow Bend, a township that no longer exists on any modern map. The letters spoke of harvests and weather, of children's illnesses and church socials, of the ordinary textures of 19th century rural existence. But they also spoke of the ground.
In a letter dated June of 1877, Harriet Summerfield wrote to her sister, "We took our dinner beneath the oak today, as the weather was fine and the children restless. Edmund insists it is wholesome to eat where we do, that the air is no different and the soil no more cursed than any other. I do not share his certainty. I feel them beneath us even when I cannot see them. I wonder sometimes if they feel us too." The letter continued. "The photographer came from Harrisburg.
Edmund wanted a record of our happiness," he said. I smiled as instructed. The children were still. But when the man prepared his plate, I saw him look at the ground behind us, and I saw his face change. He said nothing. He took his fee and left. I do not think we will see the photograph. I do not think I want to. Elena Vasquez had found the family in the photograph, and she had found the beginning of a story that would take her 3 years to uncover. A story of land and memory, of violence and silence, of a family that built its future on a field of bones. The Summerfield farm had a history, and that history was buried in the ground. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. If you value stories that history tried to erase, stories of truth buried beneath silence, then your subscription ensures these voices are never forgotten again. The land that would become the Summerfield farm had changed hands 7 times before Edmund Summerfield signed the deed in the autumn of 1874. Each transfer had been recorded in the Northumberland County Courthouse, the documents preserved in leather-bound ledgers that smelled of dust and forgotten intentions. Each transfer told part of a story that no one had thought to assemble into a single narrative, until Elena Vasquez began pulling the threads. The first recorded owner was a man named Josiah Crane, who had received the land as a grant from the colonial government of Pennsylvania in 1762. Crane was a tanner by trade, and the property's location, near a tributary of the Susquehanna River, made it ideal for the water-intensive processes of his craft. He built a small homestead, cleared several acres for grazing, and operated his tannery for nearly 2 decades. When he died in 1780, the land passed to his son, who sold it within a year to a consortium of investors from Philadelphia. The investors had grander ambitions. They planned to establish a settlement called Prosperity, a name that would prove bitterly ironic. The settlement was intended to attract families from the overcrowded eastern cities, offering affordable land and the promise of agricultural abundance. Advertisements were placed in newspapers from Boston to Baltimore. Lots were surveyed, roads were planned, and a small church was erected at the center of what was meant to become a thriving community. Prosperity never prospered. The soil, it turned out, was less fertile than advertised. The winters were harsher than the investors had anticipated. and the settlement's location, while scenic, was isolated from the markets and transportation networks that might have sustained it. By 1795, fewer than a dozen families remained. By 1802, the settlement had been abandoned entirely, its church collapsed, its roads reclaimed by forest. The land sat empty for nearly 30 years. County records showed no activity, no taxes paid, no claims filed. It was as if the property had been erased from memory, a blank space on the map where something had failed and been forgotten. Then, in 1831, a man named Cornelius Whitmore purchased the entire tract for a sum so low it suggested either desperation or deception. Whitmore was not a farmer. He was not an investor. According to the few records that mentioned him, he was a physician, though the nature of his practice was never clearly defined. What Whitmore did with the land between 1831 and 1847 remained largely undocumented. He paid his taxes. He maintained nominal ownership. But he never filed for building permits, never registered livestock, never appeared in census records as a resident of the property. He lived in Harrisburg, some 40 miles to the south, and visited the Willow Bend property only occasionally, according to the testimony of neighbors who would later be interviewed. The neighbors remembered the visits. They remembered the wagons that accompanied Whitmore, covered with canvas and driven by men who did not speak to anyone in town. They remembered the sounds that sometimes carried across the fields at night, sounds they attributed to animals, though no one could say what kind. They remembered the smell that occasionally drifted from the property when the wind shifted, a smell one farmer described as sweetish and wrong, like fruit left too long in the sun. No one investigated. No one asked questions. In rural Pennsylvania in the 1830s and 1840s, a man's property was his own business, and neighbors who valued their peace did not inquire too closely into matters that did not concern them. Cornelius Whitmore died in 1847. His death certificate listed the cause as heart failure, though some who knew him whispered that his heart had failed long before his body followed. He left no will, no heirs, no instructions for the disposition of his estate. The Willow Bend property reverted to the county, which sold it at auction to recover unpaid taxes. The buyer was a logging company that stripped the land of its timber over the following decade, leaving behind stumps and erosion and a landscape that looked like it had been wounded. When the company went bankrupt in 1859, the land changed hands twice more. Once to a speculator who never visited, once to a farmer who lasted a single winter before abandoning his claim. By the time Edmund Summerfield encountered the property in 1874, it had been empty for nearly 15 years. The asking price was negligible. The soil had recovered some of its fertility. The location, while remote, was no longer quite so isolated. A railroad spur had been extended within 10 miles, connecting the region to larger markets. For a man of modest means with ambitions of independence, it seemed like an opportunity. Edmund Summerfield was 34 years old when he purchased the farm. He had been born in New York, the son of a clerk who had died young and a mother who had remarried poorly. His childhood had been characterized by instability and want, and he had spent his young adulthood in a series of occupations: factory work, railroad construction, a brief and unsuccessful venture in dry goods that had left him exhausted and unsatisfied. When he married Harriet Crane in 1868, he promised her a better life. The Willow Bend farm was meant to be the fulfillment of that promise. Harriet had her doubts from the beginning. The property was cheaper than it should have been, and she had learned to distrust bargains. The land had a feeling to it she would later write to her sister, a heaviness in the air, a silence that seemed more than the absence of sound. The first time she walked the fields with Edmund, she noticed the unevenness of the ground, the way certain patches seemed to have settled differently than others. She noticed the way the grass grew thicker in some places, as if feeding on something richer than ordinary soil. But Edmund was determined. He saw what he wanted to see: potential, possibility, a future that his past had denied him. He signed the deed, paid the fee, and brought his family to Willow Bend in the spring of 1875. The first year was difficult but not disastrous. The Summerfields cleared additional acreage, repaired the dilapidated farmhouse that the logging company had left behind, and planted their first crops. The children, Thomas, who was 6, and Margaret, who was 4, adapted to rural life with the resilience of the young. A third child, an infant boy named William, was born in the winter of 1876. His arrival celebrated with the quiet gratitude of parents who had already buried 2 children in infancy. It was in that second year that the ground began to reveal its secrets. The spring thaw of 1876 was unusually severe. Heavy rains fell for weeks, saturating the soil and swelling the creeks beyond their banks. Erosion carved new channels across the Summerfield property, exposing layers of earth that had not seen sunlight in decades. Thomas Summerfield, playing near the oak tree that would later appear in the photograph, found the first bone. He thought it was a stick at first, bleached white and half buried in mud. He brought it to his father, who recognized it immediately for what it was. It was a human femur. Edmund told his son it was probably an animal bone, a deer, perhaps, or a large dog. He buried it again, deeper this time, and instructed Thomas not to speak of it. But over the following weeks, as the rains continued and the erosion worsened, more bones emerged. A skull appeared near the property line. A rib cage surfaced in the vegetable garden. Small bones, fingers, toes, the delicate architecture of hands, scattered across the fields like seeds planted by some malevolent farmer. Harriet wanted to leave. She begged Edmund to sell the property, to take whatever loss was necessary and start again somewhere else, but Edmund refused. They had invested everything they had in this farm. They had no savings, no family to fall back on, no prospects in a world that offered few second chances. To leave would be to admit defeat, to condemn their children to the same precarious existence that had shaped their own childhoods. Instead, Edmund made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He gathered the bones, all of them. Every fragment that the rains had exposed, every piece that his plow turned up in the fields, every remnant that his children stumbled upon in their play. He gathered them in the darkness of night, when his family was asleep and his neighbors could not see. And he buried them again, deeper this time, beneath the meadow where the oak tree stood. He did not count them. He did not try to determine how many bodies were represented, or who they might have been, or how they had come to be buried on this land. He simply wanted them gone, hidden again, forgotten again, absorbed into the earth where they could not threaten the future he was trying to build. By the summer of 1877, the meadow beneath the oak tree looked like any other meadow. The grass had grown over the disturbed soil. The mounds had settled into gentle undulations that might have been natural features of the terrain. Edmund had convinced himself that the worst was over, that the land had given up its secrets and would ask nothing more of him. He was wrong. The photograph was taken on a Sunday in June. Edmund had arranged it as a celebration of their survival, of their persistence, of the life they were building despite everything. The photographer, a man named Aldous Marsh who traveled the region offering his services to rural families, arrived in the morning and spent several hours preparing his equipment. He was a meticulous craftsman, known for the quality of his portraits and the patience he showed with restless children. But something about the Summerfield property unsettled him. In a letter he would write years later, Marsh described the experience. The family was pleasant enough, and the children well behaved. But there was something in the air of that place, a weight, a presence, that I could not explain. When I looked through my lens at the ground behind them, I saw shapes that should not have been there. I told myself it was a trick of light, an artifact of the developing process. But I knew what I saw. I knew what was beneath them. Marsh completed the photograph as contracted. He collected his fee and left Willow Bend that same afternoon, declining the Summerfields' invitation to stay for dinner. He never returned to the area. He never spoke publicly about what he had seen, but he kept a copy of the photograph in his personal files, separate from his professional archive, as if he wanted to remember, or perhaps as if he could not bring himself to forget. The photograph that Marsh left behind would outlive everyone who appeared in it. It would survive the Summerfields' eventual departure from the farm, the property's subsequent abandonment, the passage of more than a century of American history. It would find its way into a family Bible, then into an estate sale, then into the hands of a digital restoration specialist who would finally see what the photographer had seen. The ground beneath the happy family was not empty. and the story of what lay buried there was only beginning to emerge. Elena Vasquez spent 3 months in Pennsylvania, reading letters and county records by day, and lying awake at night, unable to escape the weight of what she was uncovering. The Summerfield letters provided the emotional texture of the story. Harriet's growing unease, her children's nightmares, the slow erosion of Edmund's certainty that he had made the right choice. But the letters could not explain the bones themselves. For that, Vasquez needed to dig deeper into the past. The key was Cornelius Whitmore. Whitmore had left almost no personal papers. His medical practice in Harrisburg had been modest, his social connections limited, his death unremarked by any newspaper or memorial. He seemed designed to be forgotten, a man who had passed through life without leaving footprints. But Whitmore had enemies, and enemies have long memories. In the archives of the Pennsylvania State Library, Vasquez found a collection of letters written by a physician named Dr. Samuel Brennan, who had practiced in Harrisburg during the same years as Whitmore. Brennan had been a prominent figure in the medical community, a founding member of the State Medical Society, and a vocal advocate for professional standards in an era when medicine was still largely unregulated. His letters revealed a bitter rivalry with Whitmore that had lasted for more than a decade. The nature of that rivalry was professional, but its roots were moral. Whitmore, according to Brennan's letters, was not a healer. He was a supplier. His practice, such as it was, served as a front for a far more lucrative enterprise: the procurement and sale of human bodies for anatomical dissection. In the early and mid-19th century, American medical schools faced a chronic shortage of cadavers for teaching purposes. Legal restrictions on dissection, combined with public horror at the desecration of the dead, meant that legitimate sources of bodies, executed criminals, unclaimed indigents, were vastly insufficient to meet demand. A black market emerged to fill the gap, supplied by men who dug up fresh graves in the darkness of night and delivered their harvest to medical colleges that asked no questions about provenance. These men were called resurrection men, or body snatchers, and they operated with impunity in many American cities throughout the first half of the 19th century. Some worked alone, selling bodies to the highest bidder. Others formed networks, with suppliers in rural areas funneling bodies to distributors in urban centers. The trade was lucrative, illegal, and essential to the advancement of medical education. Cornelius Whitmore, according to Dr. Brennan's accusations, was more than a body snatcher. He was an industrialist of death. The Willow Bend property, Brennan alleged, served as Whitmore's processing facility. Bodies were brought there from across the region, exhumed from rural cemeteries, collected from poorhouses and prisons, acquired through means that Brennan would only describe as unspeakable. At Willow Bend, the bodies were prepared for transport, preserved through techniques that Whitmore had learned in his medical training, and shipped to medical schools in Philadelphia, New York, and Baltimore. The income from this trade made Whitmore wealthy. The consequences of this trade were buried in the fields where Edmund Summerfield would later picnic with his family. Brennan's accusations were never proven. He had no evidence beyond rumor and suspicion, no witnesses willing to testify, no legal authority interested in investigating a physician who paid his taxes and kept to himself. Whitmore threatened to sue for defamation, and Brennan backed down, his letters becoming less specific, his accusations more carefully hedged. By the time Whitmore died, the matter had been forgotten by everyone except Brennan, who continued to write about it obsessively in his private correspondence. "I know what he did," Brennan wrote in a letter dated 1852, 5 years after Whitmore's death. "I know the ground where he hid his sins. Someday that ground will speak. Someday the earth will give up its dead, and everyone will know what I have always known." That day came in 1876, when the spring rains exposed the first bones on the Summerfield property. Edmund Summerfield had no way of knowing what he had purchased. He had no way of knowing that the land he was farming had been used as a dumping ground for bodies that could not be accounted for, whose identities had been erased along with their lives. But Harriet suspected. In her letters to her sister, she wrote of the bones with a horror that went beyond the physical. "They are not merely dead," she wrote in August of 1876. "They are forsaken. No one knows their names. No one mourned them. They were buried here not because this was their home, but because this was where no one would look. And now we have built our home above them, and I cannot escape the feeling that they know. Harriet's suspicions deepened over the following year. She noticed that certain areas of the property seemed to resist cultivation, patches where crops withered, where animals refused to graze, where the soil itself seemed somehow wrong. She noticed that her children had begun having nightmares, dreams of hands reaching up from the ground, of voices calling from beneath the earth. She noticed that Edmund had changed, becoming quieter, more withdrawn, spending long hours walking the fields alone in the twilight. And she noticed the smell. It came and went, unpredictable as weather. Some days the air was clean, carrying only the scent of grass and earth and the ordinary decay of farm life. Other days, a different smell drifted across the property, faint but unmistakable, the smell that the neighbors had noticed decades earlier when Whitmore had owned the land. Harriet described it as the smell of something that refused to rest. Pause here for a moment. If this story has touched something in you, if you have felt the weight of these forgotten souls, I ask you to leave a comment with this phrase: "Some ground never forgets." Your words will join the thousands of others who refuse to let silence bury the truth. The summer of 1877 was the last season the Summerfields would spend on the farm. The photograph beneath the oak tree was taken in June. By September, they were gone. The exact circumstances of their departure remain unclear. Harriet's letters to her sister became less frequent as the summer progressed, and the final letter in the collection, dated August 14, 1877, was cryptic and distressed. "We cannot stay," she wrote. "Edmund has finally seen what I have always known. The land is not ours. It belongs to them, and they want it back. We will leave before the first frost. We will not speak of this place again. I ask that you burn these letters and forget I ever sent them." Her sister did not burn the letters. She kept them, passed them down through her family, and eventually donated them to the Historical Society, where Elena Vasquez would find them more than a century later. The Summerfields sold the farm in October of 1877 for a fraction of what Edmund had paid for it. The buyer was a land speculator from Philadelphia who never visited the property, holding it as an investment until his own death in 1889. After that, the land passed through several more hands, each owner holding it for shorter periods, each sale accompanied by rumors that the property was somehow cursed. By 1920, the farmhouse had collapsed. By 1950, the fields had returned to forest. By 1980, the township of Willow Bend had been absorbed into a larger municipal district, its name erased from maps and memory. The land where the Summerfields had picnicked, where Cornelius Whitmore had buried his trade, where unknown dozens or hundreds had been laid in unmarked graves, became indistinguishable from the surrounding wilderness. The photograph survived because Aldous Marsh had kept a copy, because that copy had been passed to his descendants, because one of those descendants had placed it in a family Bible, because that Bible had been sold at an estate sale, because a digital restoration specialist had noticed something strange about the ground. The photograph survived because some truths refused to be erased. In the spring of 2024, Elena Vasquez published her preliminary findings in a historical journal. The article attracted attention not only from academics, but from journalists, documentary filmmakers, and descendants of families who had lived in the region during the 19th century. Among those who reached out was a retired forensic anthropologist named Dr. Marcus Webb. Webb had spent 30 years working with law enforcement agencies across the United States, helping to identify remains and reconstruct the circumstances of death. He had examined victims of serial killers, casualties of natural disasters, and bodies recovered from mass graves in conflict zones. He had seen more death than most people could imagine, and he had learned to approach it with scientific detachment. But the Summerfield photograph affected him in ways he could not entirely explain. "There's something about those mounds," he said in an interview after joining Vasquez's research team. "The spacing, the size, the way they're arranged. It's not random. Someone put those bodies there deliberately, methodically, with a system, and when you see a system like that, you know you're dealing with something more than ordinary crime. You're dealing with an enterprise." Webb offered his expertise to Vasquez, and together they began planning an archaeological investigation of the site. The challenges were considerable. The exact location of the Summerfield farm had been lost to time and administrative reorganization. The landscape had changed dramatically over the past century, with roads built, forests cleared and regrown, and property lines redrawn multiple times. Finding the precise spot where the photograph had been taken would require a combination of historical research, geographic analysis, and considerable luck. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A retired surveyor named Howard Chen, who had worked in the region for decades, contacted the research team after reading about their project in a local newspaper. Chen had copies of survey maps dating back to the 1920s, including one that showed the remnants of the Summerfield farmstead and the location of the distinctive oak tree that appeared in the photograph. The tree, remarkably, was still standing. Oaks can live for centuries under favorable conditions, and this specimen had apparently thrived despite the abandonment of the surrounding land. Chen's maps showed its location relative to property boundaries and natural features that could still be identified in the modern landscape. Using these references, the research team was able to pinpoint the site of the original meadow to within a few dozen feet. What they found there confirmed their worst suspicions. The first ground-penetrating radar survey, conducted in June of 2024, revealed extensive subsurface anomalies consistent with buried human remains. The anomalies were concentrated in an area roughly the size of a football field, arranged in rows that matched the pattern visible in the original photograph. Preliminary estimates suggested that the site might contain the remains of more than 200 individuals. The decision to excavate was not made lightly. Archaeological excavation of human remains is a complex process, governed by legal requirements, ethical considerations, and the practical challenges of preserving fragile evidence. The team secured necessary permits, consulted with descendant communities and Native American tribal authorities who might have claims to the site, and established protocols for respectful treatment of any remains discovered. The excavation began in September of 2024 and continued through the following spring. What emerged from the ground rewrote not only the history of the Summerfield property, but the understanding of the body-snatching trade in 19th century America. The remains represented individuals of all ages and both sexes. Some showed evidence of autopsy or surgical experimentation, skulls opened and imperfectly closed, limbs removed at the joints, torsos sectioned with the precision of medical instruction. Others appeared to have been buried intact, their bodies preserved through some chemical process that had left traces in the surrounding soil. Still others had been reduced to fragments, scattered and commingled in ways that suggested hasty burial without regard for the dignity of the dead. Many of the individuals showed signs of disease or malnutrition consistent with institutional populations, the residents of poorhouses, prisons, and asylums who had died without family to claim them. Others appeared to have been healthy at death, their bodies taken not from institutional graves but from private cemeteries, or perhaps directly from the circumstances of their dying. Forensic analysis suggested that the burials had occurred over a period of approximately 15 years, from the early 1830s through the late 1840s, precisely the period when Cornelius Whitmore had owned the property. The scale of the operation exceeded anything previously documented in the historical record of the body-snatching trade. This wasn't grave robbing in the traditional sense, Webb explained at a press conference following the preliminary findings. This was systematic acquisition of human bodies on an industrial scale. Someone was supplying medical schools throughout the eastern seaboard, and they needed a place to dispose of bodies that couldn't be sold, damaged specimens, decomposed remains, individuals whose disappearance had attracted attention. This site was their landfill. This was where the evidence was buried. The question of identity proved more difficult to answer. Few of the remains could be associated with specific individuals. Records of the institutional dead from this period were incomplete or non-existent. Many of the bodies appeared to have been stripped of any identifying materials before burial. The people buried beneath the Summerfield meadow had been erased twice. Once in life, when they became invisible to the society that should have protected them, and again in death, when their bodies were commodified and discarded. But the research team did not give up on identification. Using genealogical databases, historical records, and emerging DNA analysis techniques, they began the painstaking work of connecting remains to names. By the end of 2025, they had tentatively identified 17 individuals, 14 men and 3 women whose disappearances had been noted in the historical record and whose descendants could be located for comparison. Each identification brought a small measure of justice. Families who had wondered for generations what had happened to ancestors who vanished without explanation finally received answers. Memorial services were held, graves were marked. The invisible dead began, slowly, to become visible again. One identification in particular captured public attention. Among the remains was a woman in her 30s whose dental characteristics and healed bone fractures matched records of a seamstress named Eliza Thornton, who had disappeared from Philadelphia in 1841. Thornton had been a free black woman, a skilled craftswoman who supported herself and her aging mother through her work. She had vanished one evening while walking home from a customer's house, and despite her family's efforts, no trace of her had ever been found. Her mother had died without knowing what had happened to her daughter. Her siblings had spent decades searching, writing letters to authorities, placing advertisements in newspapers, pursuing every rumor and lead. They had never stopped hoping that Eliza might be alive somewhere, that she might return to them. Now, nearly 200 years later, her remains had been found in a mass grave in rural Pennsylvania, hundreds of miles from home. Her body had been sold, dissected, and discarded by men who saw her not as a person, but as a product. Her suffering had been erased from history until a photograph of a family picnic accidentally preserved the evidence of her burial place. Eliza Thornton's descendants were located through genealogical research. They traveled to Pennsylvania for a ceremony marking the identification of her remains. Her great-great-great-granddaughter, a woman named Denise Coleman, spoke at the ceremony. "All those years, my family wondered," Coleman said, her voice steady despite the weight of emotion. "We passed down the story of Eliza, generation after generation, the aunt who disappeared without a trace. We never stopped hoping she would be found, and now she has been. Not the way we wanted, not alive, but found, named, remembered. That matters. That matters more than I can say." The identification of Eliza Thornton and others like her transformed the Summerfield investigation from a historical curiosity into a reckoning with the racial dimensions of the body-snatching trade. Research had long established that African Americans, both free and enslaved, had been disproportionately targeted by body snatchers. Their graves were considered less risky to rob, their disappearances less likely to be investigated, their bodies more expendable in the eyes of the medical establishment that created the demand. The mass grave beneath the Summerfield meadow provided physical evidence of this disparity. Of the remains recovered, a significant proportion showed skeletal characteristics consistent with African ancestry. These individuals had been taken from their communities, their bodies exploited for profit and education, and their identities erased. They had been buried in unmarked graves on land that would later be farmed by a family that knew nothing of their presence. The photograph of the Summerfield picnic took on new meaning in this context. The image of a white family eating contentedly above the bodies of the forgotten dead became a metaphor for a larger American pattern: the building of prosperity on foundations of unacknowledged suffering, the cultivation of happiness in soil fertilized by injustice. The investigation of the Summerfield site continued through 2025 and into 2026, with each season bringing new discoveries and new questions. The total number of individuals buried on the property was eventually estimated at between 250 and 300, a number that made it one of the largest sites of its kind ever documented in the United States. Not all of those individuals could be identified. Not all of them could be connected to families who might claim their remains. Many would remain anonymous, their identities lost to the combination of deliberate erasure and the simple passage of time. But the investigation had effects that extended far beyond the physical site. It prompted re-examination of other properties associated with Cornelius Whitmore, leading to the discovery of smaller burial sites in 2 other Pennsylvania counties. It sparked investigations into similar operations in other states, revealing the geographic scope of the 19th century body trade. It contributed to growing calls for reform in how medical schools acknowledged and addressed their historical complicity in the exploitation of vulnerable populations. And it changed how Americans understood a seemingly innocent photograph. The image of the Summerfield family picnic was reproduced in newspapers, magazines, and documentary films. It appeared in museum exhibitions and history textbooks. It became one of the most recognized photographs of the 19th century, not because of its artistic merit or technical quality, but because of what it revealed about the hidden foundations of American prosperity. For the descendants of the Summerfield family, the photograph's fame was a complicated inheritance. Many had known nothing of their ancestors' time on the Willow Bend property. The family, as Harriet had requested, had not spoken of that place. Those who learned the story through media coverage experienced a range of reactions: shame, grief, confusion, and a painful awareness that their forebears had built their lives, however briefly and unwittingly, on a mass grave. Some descendants chose to participate in the memorial activities organized at the site. They attended ceremonies marking the identification of remains, contributed to funds supporting forensic analysis, and spoke publicly about the importance of confronting difficult family histories. Others preferred to remain private, processing the revelations in their own ways and on their own terms. One descendant, a retired teacher named Robert Summerfield from Ohio, wrote a letter that was read at a memorial ceremony in 2026. "My family did not create this tragedy," he wrote, "but my family lived with it, benefited from land that hid it, and kept silent about what they discovered. That silence was its own kind of complicity. I cannot undo what was done, but I can refuse to be silent any longer. I can add my voice to those who demand that these people be remembered. I can acknowledge that my family's story is inseparable from their story. We are connected by that ground, whether we want to be or not." The site itself was eventually designated as a memorial, its management entrusted to a non-profit organization dedicated to honoring the forgotten dead. The oak tree under which the Summerfields had picnicked became the centerpiece of the memorial, its branches spreading over ground that had been carefully restored after the excavations. Plaques marked the locations where remains had been found, listing the names of those who had been identified and noting the many more who remained unknown. Visitors came from across the country and eventually from around the world to pay their respects. They brought flowers, left notes, stood in silence beneath the tree. Some were descendants of those buried there, finally able to visit the resting place of ancestors whose fates had been unknown for generations. Others were students of history, medical professionals confronting their field's complicated past, or simply people moved by a story of loss and recovery. The photograph that had started it all was reproduced on a panel near the memorial's entrance. Visitors could compare the original image to the restored landscape, seeing how the mounds that had been barely visible in 1877 had been transformed into markers of remembrance. The family in the photograph, Edmund, Harriet, Thomas, Margaret, and the infant William, remained frozen in their moment of apparent contentment, surrounded by evidence of a history they had tried to escape. That history, as the memorial's designers understood, was not merely about one family or one property. It was about systems of exploitation that had operated across American society for generations, systems that had reduced human beings to commodities, erased their identities, and hidden the evidence of their suffering. The Summerfield site was one location where those systems had intersected with the lives of ordinary people. There were countless others, most of which would never be discovered. The memorial's mission, as articulated by its founders, was not only to honor the dead, but to challenge the living. It invited visitors to consider how present-day systems might be producing similar invisibilities. People whose lives were undervalued, whose deaths went unremarked, whose bodies might be exploited for profit or convenience. It asked whether the patterns revealed in 19th century Pennsylvania had truly ended, or whether they had simply taken new forms. These questions had no easy answers, but the asking of them, the memorial's designers believed, was itself a form of justice, a refusal to accept the silence that had protected the perpetrators of past atrocities. The ground had finally spoken. The earth had given up its dead, as Dr. Brennan had predicted so long ago, and those who heard could no longer claim ignorance. Elena Vasquez completed her dissertation in 2027, a comprehensive study of the Willow Bend site and its significance for understanding the body trade in 19th century America. The work earned her academic recognition and launched a career dedicated to uncovering similar histories of exploitation and erasure. But she remained haunted by questions the research could not answer. What had happened to the Summerfields after they left the farm? The family had disappeared from historical records after 1877, their subsequent lives untraced until descendants were located through genealogical databases. The records that eventually emerged painted a picture of quiet, ordinary existence. Edmund had found work as a clerk in Philadelphia. Harriet had raised the children. Thomas and Margaret had grown up and started families of their own. The infant William had survived childhood and become a schoolteacher. None of them had ever spoken publicly about the farm. None had left letters or diaries describing their experiences. The family's silence, which Harriet had requested in her final letter, had been maintained across generations, broken only when the photograph surfaced and researchers came looking for context. But one piece of evidence, discovered late in the investigation, suggested that the Summerfields' departure from Willow Bend had not been as simple as the letters implied. In 2028, a researcher working with the Memorial Organization discovered a police report filed in Harrisburg in October of 1877. The report described a disturbance at a property matching the description of the Summerfield farm. A commotion in the night, involving fire and loud voices, reported by a neighbor traveling the county road. The officer who responded found the farmhouse partially burned, its contents scattered, and no one present. The Summerfields' possessions had been left behind, including furniture, clothing, and household goods that a departing family would normally have taken with them. The officer noted that there was no evidence of foul play, but also no explanation for the hasty departure. He observed that the ground near the oak tree appeared freshly disturbed, as if someone had been digging, and that a strong smell hung over the property despite the fire damage. His report concluded, "The family appears to have fled in haste for reasons unknown. No injuries observed, no crimes apparent. The property should be secured until the owners can be located." The Summerfields were never officially located. Their sale of the property, recorded a few weeks later, had been conducted through an attorney in Philadelphia, who declined to reveal his client's whereabouts. The family had vanished from Willow Bend as completely as the bones Edmund had buried, leaving behind only the photograph and the questions it raised. What had happened that night in October 1877? What had driven the Summerfields from their home with such urgency that they left their possessions behind? What had Edmund been digging for near the oak tree, and what had he found? These questions, like so many others surrounding the Willow Bend site, could not be definitively answered. The evidence was gone, consumed by fire and time and the deliberate silence of those who knew the truth. Only the photograph remained, its serene surface concealing depths that continued to reveal themselves. In the years following the memorial's establishment, scholars and visitors continued to find new details in the image. Advanced digital analysis revealed additional features of the landscape that had not been visible to earlier viewers. The remnants of a fence line that might have marked the boundary of the burial area, the shadow of a structure in the background that might have been a building used by Whitmore, the faint impressions in the blanket that suggested the family was not sitting on solid ground. Each new discovery added to the story without completing it. The photograph had become a palimpsest, layer upon layer of meaning, accumulating like sediment, like the soil that had covered the bones, like the silence that had covered the truth. And perhaps that incompleteness was itself the point. Some stories could never be fully told, because the voices that could have told them had been silenced. The photograph preserved a moment, a fragment, a glimpse into a world that had tried to erase its own history. The work of recovery and remembrance was not about achieving closure, but about maintaining witness, keeping faith with the forgotten, refusing to let their silence become permanent. The Summerfield photograph, in this sense, was not a puzzle to be solved, but a responsibility to be shouldered. It asked viewers to look closely, to see what had been hidden, to acknowledge what had been denied. It asked them to remember that beneath every surface there might be depths. Beneath every happiness there might be suffering. Beneath every ground there might be bones. That awareness was the photograph's final gift. The capacity to see the world differently, to question what had always been taken for granted, to recognize that history was not merely the past, but a presence that shaped the present and would continue to shape the future. The family in the photograph remained frozen in 1877, their smiles unchanged by all that had been revealed about the ground beneath them. But the ground itself had changed. transformed from a secret shame into a site of remembrance. The dead had been named, as many as could be named. Their stories had been told, as fully as they could be told. They had been brought from invisibility into memory, from silence into speech. And the photograph that had made this possible, the image that a restoration specialist had enhanced, that a graduate student had contextualized, that a forensic anthropologist had investigated, remained as evidence that some truths, no matter how deeply buried, eventually find their way to light. If you have watched this far, it is because you felt the weight of this story, the weight of lives erased and recovered, of ground that kept its secrets until the right eyes learned how to see. If you have watched this far, it is because you understand that some stories must never be forgotten, that some silences must be broken, that some truths are worth the telling. Leave a comment saying, "I've watched this far, so I can get to know you and see who really values the stories here on this channel." If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Press the like button to help more people discover these forgotten histories. And subscribe if you have not already to join this community of witnesses, people who refuse to let the past be buried, who believe that remembrance is a form of justice, who understand that beneath every photograph there may be a story waiting to be told. The ground holds its secrets, but we have learned how to listen. Until next time.